January 5, 1943. Guadalcanal. The morning air hangs thick with humidity as Lieutenant Red Cochrane watches 4 distant specks materialize through the haze. Japanese Aichi dive bombers. Vals, slow and obsolete by most standards but still deadly when flown by determined pilots who know the angles. One breaks formation and dives toward the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. The impact shakes the water for miles. Then the surviving 3 peel away, climbing back toward the clouds, their mission complete. Standard doctrine says they've escaped. The range is too great. Traditional anti-aircraft fire requires direct hits or perfectly timed explosions, and both demand accuracy that borders on impossible against fast-moving targets at extreme distance. But Cochrane isn't using traditional ammunition. In the aft 5-inch battery of the cruiser USS Helena sit shells that look ordinary enough from the outside. 20 3/4 inches long, 55 pounds of steel, and explosive, identical to thousands fired before. Except these shells carry something inside their nose cones that shouldn't exist. A miniature radar transmitter and receiver, complete with vacuum tubes and circuitry, somehow engineered to survive forces that would shatter any electronic device ever built. The technology packed into a space smaller than a pint milk bottle. Cochrane's gun crew fires, not a full barrage. Just 3 shells, almost an afterthought as the Japanese bombers disappear into the distance. The first shell screams upward at 2,800 feet per second. Inside its nose, components designed to withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity suddenly activate. A tiny transmitter begins pulsing radio waves into the surrounding air at 180 megahertz. The shell spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute from the rifling grooves, creating centrifugal forces that would pulverize conventional electronics into dust. But these aren't conventional electronics. The second shell follows. Then the third. 2,000 feet from the nearest Val, one shell's radio pulse bounces back with a frequency shift that triggers a circuit closing. The shell explodes. Not on impact, not after a predetermined time, but at the precise moment when its proximity to the target guarantees maximum lethality. Shrapnel tears through the Val's fuselage and wing structure. The bomber shudders, loses lift, and falls into the Pacific. The gun crew stares at the result. A kill without a direct hit, a kill at range where traditional fuses would have been useless. What just happened violated everything they understood about anti-aircraft warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The technology Lieutenant Cochrane's shells carried had consumed more American resources and scientific talent than any weapon development, except the atomic bomb itself. 3 years earlier, it didn't exist, not because no one had imagined it, but because the engineering challenges appeared insurmountable. The concept was simple enough that artillery officers had dreamed about it for generations, a shell that knew when it was near its target and detonated automatically, turning near misses into kills. But translating that dream into reality required solving problems that seemed to violate the laws of physics and materials science. The challenge began with basic artillery physics. When a 5-inch naval gun fires, the shell experiences acceleration forces equivalent to 20,000 times Earth's gravity. For context, a human body experiences approximately 4 times gravity during a hard turn in a fighter aircraft. 20,000 times gravity means every component inside the shell suddenly weighs 20,000 times its normal weight. A vacuum tube that weighs a few grams becomes a crushing force of tens of kilograms pressing against its own structure. Glass shatters, filaments snap, circuit connections tear apart, and this isn't a brief spike. The acceleration continues for the fraction of a second. The shell travels down the gun barrel, followed immediately by rotational forces, as rifling grooves spin the projectile to stabilization speeds approaching 30,000 revolutions per minute. But acceleration and spin were just the beginning. The fuse needed electrical power, which meant batteries small enough to fit in the available space while generating sufficient voltage to operate radio circuits. It needed to distinguish between the ground, the ocean, friendly ships, and enemy aircraft. It needed to function in temperatures ranging from 100 degrees Fahrenheit to -50. It needed safety mechanisms to prevent premature detonation that could destroy the gun crew or nearby ships. It needed manufacturing processes precise enough to mass-produce millions of identical units while maintaining reliability standards. And it needed to accomplish all of this using 1940s technology in an era before transistors, before integrated circuits, before any of the miniaturization advances that would later make such devices routine. In June of 1940, the National Defense Research Committee assigned Section T of the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory to investigate proximity fuse development. The T stood for tube, though the designation was deliberately vague to obscure the program's purpose. Dr. Merle Tuver, the physicist leading the effort, assembled a team that would eventually include 3% of all physicists working in the United States. Their mandate was simple in concept and staggering in execution. Create a working proximity fuse for anti-aircraft artillery. Do it faster than enemy nations pursuing similar research. And maintain absolute secrecy, because if the technology fell into enemy hands before achieving operational deployment, American naval forces would face the same innovation turned against them. The British had started earlier. In 1939, scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment conceived of proximity fuses using photoelectric cells and primitive radio systems. They successfully developed fuses for unrotated projectiles, the British term for unguided rockets. But rockets experienced relatively gentle acceleration compared to artillery shells. A rocket motor generates thrust gradually over several seconds. An artillery gun generates its thrust in milliseconds, producing acceleration forces an order of magnitude greater. British researchers concluded that shells fired from guns created forces that no electronic fuse could survive during World War II. They shared their research with American teams during the Tizard mission of 1940, including detailed designs for radio and photoelectric fuses, but emphasized that artillery applications appeared impossible with existing technology. The Germans had been pursuing proximity fuse research since the early 1930s. Captured documents would later reveal more than 30 different German proximity fuse designs under development, using acoustic triggering, electromagnetic fields, capacitive effects, and radio detection. But German research efforts suffered from fragmentation across competing military branches and industrial contractors. The Kriegsmarine pursued different approaches than the Luftwaffe. Private companies developed proprietary designs without coordination, and Adolf Hitler personally ordered development priorities shifted away from defensive weapons systems around 1941, when German military doctrine still emphasized offensive operations. The Germans possessed the theoretical knowledge but lacked the focused industrial coordination to transform theory into deployable weapons. American researchers approached the problem with systematic methodology that combined scientific innovation with industrial pragmatism. The first critical breakthrough came from miniaturized vacuum tubes developed by Sylvania Electric Products. Standard radio tubes of the 1940s stood several inches tall with glass envelopes designed for reliability over thousands of hours of operation in stationary equipment. The proximity fuse needed tubes smaller than a thumbnail that could withstand catastrophic shock loads while functioning for perhaps 90 seconds of flight time. Sylvania engineers redesigned tube construction from basic principles, creating rugged miniature units with reinforced filaments, shock-resistant glass, and planar electrode designs that distributed forces evenly. The second breakthrough involved battery design. Conventional batteries used liquid electrolytes that would splash or freeze under artillery conditions. The fuse needed a battery that remained inactive during storage and transportation, activating only after the shell fired, then delivering stable voltage throughout the shell's flight. Engineers developed reserve batteries using solid chemical components, separated by thin barriers. When the shell fired, inertial forces broke the barriers, mixing chemicals that generated electricity. A built-in delay of several milliseconds ensured the shell cleared the gun barrel before the electrical system armed, preventing premature detonation that could endanger the crew. The radio circuit itself required innovation in miniaturization and ruggedness. The fuse transmitted continuous radio waves, using the shell's metal body as an antenna. As the shell approached a target, radio waves reflected back, created a Doppler shift in frequency. When this frequency shift reached a predetermined threshold, indicating target proximity, the circuit closed and fired a small detonator in the fuse base, which triggered the main explosive charge. The entire radio system, including transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and switching circuit, occupied a volume slightly larger than a shotgun shell while consuming minimal electrical power. Testing began in August of 1942 at the Naval Proving Ground in Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland served as the test platform, firing experimental fuses at radio-controlled drone aircraft. The first day's results exceeded all expectations. Gunners destroyed target drones with the first 4 bursts fired, each shell detonating near enough to the drone to inflict fatal damage without requiring a direct hit. The drone's controllers attempted evasive maneuvers. The fuses adjusted automatically, their radio circuits detecting range regardless of target behavior. Navy leadership, watching from observation vessels, immediately understood the implications. They were witnessing a transformation in anti-aircraft warfare as significant as the introduction of radar. Production authorization came swiftly. 5 companies received contracts for fuse assembly: Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris. But assembly represented only part of the industrial challenge. The fuse contained approximately 100 to 30 separate components, each requiring precision manufacturing. 87 different firms using 110 factories eventually participated in the supply chain. Sylvania alone needed to produce millions of miniature vacuum tubes to specifications that had never existed before. Quality control demanded testing procedures that verified each component's ability to withstand artillery forces. The first production fuses reached the Pacific Fleet in November of 1942. 4,500 shells equipped with variable time fuses, designated Mark 32, distributed to warships operating in the South Pacific Theater. Security protocols restricted their use to over-water engagements, where duds would sink into the ocean rather than falling on land where enemy forces might recover them. The Navy calculated that maintaining technological superiority required absolute prevention of enemy analysis of captured fuses. Even one unexploded shell recovered by Japanese or German engineers could reveal design principles that would allow them to develop countermeasures or copy the technology. USS Helena received 500 proximity-fused shells in October of 1942, replacing a portion of her standard anti-aircraft ammunition. Her gun crews received minimal briefing about the new shell's capabilities. Security restrictions prevented detailed technical explanations. The shells were simply described as having improved effectiveness against fast-moving targets. Fire them at enemy aircraft, same procedures as conventional shells, expect better results. The crews loaded them, stored them, and waited for combat opportunities to reveal whether the promises were true. On the morning of January 5, 1943, Lieutenant Cochrane's gun crew answered that question. The 3 shells fired, 1 kill achieved, proved the concept under actual combat conditions, but statistics required larger sample sizes. Individual successes could result from chance. The Navy needed sustained combat performance data showing consistent improvement over conventional ammunition. That data arrived quickly. Throughout 1943, naval gun crews fired 9,128 rounds of 5-inch proximity-fused ammunition at enemy aircraft. They destroyed 61 planes. 155 rounds per kill. Conventional time-fused ammunition required 508 rounds per kill during the same period. The proximity fuse had made anti-aircraft guns more than 3 times as effective. Japanese pilots noticed immediately. Post-battle interrogation of prisoners revealed widespread discussion among Japanese aircrew about American anti-aircraft fire suddenly becoming uncannily accurate. Shells that should have missed were exploding at precisely the right distance to inflict damage. Traditional evasive maneuvers provided no protection. Pilots reported that American ships were somehow tracking their aircraft with invisible sensors that timed explosions perfectly. They had no framework for understanding proximity fuses. The concept remained so classified that even many American military personnel remained unaware of the technology's existence. German military intelligence received reports about unusual American anti-aircraft effectiveness, but dismissed them as exaggeration or improved conventional fire control. German technical experts had concluded that proximity fuses for artillery shells were impossible because the acceleration forces would destroy any electronic components. This conviction was so strong that when German forces later captured unexploded American shells containing proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, their engineers initially failed to recognize what they had found. The captured fuses were examined, photographed, and analyzed. German scientists noted the miniature radio circuits and vacuum tubes, but they concluded these components must serve some other purpose, perhaps a sophisticated time delay mechanism, because functional proximity fuses capable of surviving artillery launch remained beyond the realm of technical possibility. This technological blindness gave American forces a decisive advantage that persisted throughout 1944 and into 1945. By late 1943, production rates had climbed to 40,000 fuses per day. By war's end, daily production reached 70,000 units. The industrial machine that supported proximity fuse manufacturing represented one of World War II's remarkable examples of American productive capacity. Not just the ability to innovate, but the ability to transform innovation into millions of standardized components, delivered to combat zones worldwide, maintained through complex supply chains, and deployed by trained personnel who often didn't understand the technology they were using. The Pacific Fleet integrated proximity fuses into standard anti-aircraft doctrine throughout 1944. Every major warship carried significant stocks of VT-fused ammunition, but the real transformation in proximity fuse application came not from anti-aircraft use, but from a completely different tactical role that emerged when the technology demonstrated capabilities its inventors had never anticipated. The shells that changed Lieutenant Cochrane's morning near Guadalcanal had been designed for one specific purpose: kill enemy aircraft. But war has a way of finding unexpected uses for new technologies, and the proximity fuse was about to prove its value in ways that would transform ground warfare as fundamentally as it had transformed naval anti-aircraft defense. The innovation that made American naval proxa guns 3 times more effective against aircraft was about to make American artillery 7 times more lethal against German ground forces. The transformation began with a question that artillery officers had been asking since the invention of explosive shells. How do you maximize the killing radius of an artillery burst? Traditional artillery used 2 types of fuses: contact fuses that detonated on impact with the ground, and time fuses that detonated after a predetermined delay calculated by the gun crew. Contact fuses buried much of the explosion's energy in the earth, sending shrapnel primarily upward and outward in a cone pattern. Time fuses detonated in the air if correctly timed, but timing required accurate range estimation, weather compensation, and precise mechanical fuse setting mechanisms. A shell that detonated too high wasted its energy. A shell that detonated too low became effectively a contact round. The margin for error was measured in fractions of a second and translated directly into whether the shell killed enemy soldiers or merely frightened them. Proximity fuses offered a potential solution, but adapting the technology from anti-aircraft to ground burst applications required significant modification. The original naval fuses detected aircraft by radio reflection from metal surfaces thousands of feet in the air. Ground applications needed fuses that would detect proximity to the Earth itself and detonate at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. Engineers modified the radio circuits to increase ground return sensitivity while maintaining reliability under artillery shock loads. Testing at military ranges across the United States determined optimal detonation heights for different artillery calibers. 105mm and 155mm shells, the most common American field artillery pieces, achieved maximum casualty effect when detonating approximately 30 feet above ground. Larger caliber weapons like 240mm howitzers required burst heights exceeding 70 feet. The effectiveness difference was dramatic. Time-fused shells set for airburst inflicted casualties across a roughly circular area depending on shell size and fragmentation characteristics. But fuse setting errors, especially in combat conditions with incomplete range data or changing weather, frequently resulted in ground bursts or detonations at incorrect heights. Proximity fuses eliminated timing variables entirely. Every shell detonated at optimal height automatically. The consistency transformed artillery from an area suppression weapon into a precision casualty-producing system. And there was another advantage that emerged from combat testing. Traditional defensive techniques against artillery, trenches, foxholes, shell craters, logs and earth revetments, lost much of their protective value. An airburst showered fragments downward into positions that shielded soldiers from horizontal shrapnel. Cover that had been effective against conventional artillery suddenly became inadequate. By mid-1944, American artillery units in Europe had received modified proximity fuses designated for ground burst applications. But Pentagon leadership maintained strict restrictions on their use. The fuses remained classified at a level comparable to the Manhattan Project. Using them on the European continent risked capture by German forces. Even though German engineers had already examined captured naval fuses without recognizing their function, military intelligence worried that repeated exposure to the technology would eventually lead to successful reverse engineering. German scientific capability remained formidable despite Allied bombing. German industry had demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Allowing the Germans to develop their own proximity fuses or effective countermeasures could negate American technological advantage. The restriction frustrated field commanders who understood the potential tactical benefits. General George Patton's Third Army received supplies of VT-fused artillery shells, but strict orders prohibited their use except in cases where recovery by enemy forces was impossible. The weapons existed. The ammunition sat in supply dumps, but tactical employment remained forbidden by the very caution that had kept the technology secret throughout its development. Meanwhile, German forces continued using conventional artillery doctrine, unaware that American units possessed weapons capability that would transform ground combat. The restriction lasted until December 16, 1944. That morning, German forces launched their last major offensive on the Western Front, attacking through the Ardennes forest in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The offensive caught American units by surprise, achieved significant initial territorial gains, and threatened to recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly. American forces needed every available tactical advantage, and suddenly, the risk of German forces capturing proximity fuses seemed less important than the risk of German forces achieving breakthrough victories. December 19th, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested authorization to employ VT-fused artillery shells against German ground forces. Pentagon leadership approved within 48 hours. On December 21st, all restrictions on proximity fuse use in Europe were lifted. Artillery units that had been stockpiling the shells for months suddenly had permission to use them. The effect on German forces was immediate and devastating. American artillery battalions adjusted their fire plans to utilize proximity fuses' automatic airburst capabilities. Shells that previously would have required careful timing and adjustment now simply worked. Fire missions that once took minutes of ranging and bracketing now achieved maximum effect on first salvo. General Patton's Third Army artillery caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River. A battalion concentration of proximity-fused shells rained down on the exposed German troops at optimal burst height. The official casualty count showed 702 Germans killed in a single artillery strike. Traditional time-fused shells might have killed a fraction of that number. Proximity fuses had turned an already deadly weapon system into something approaching mathematical certainty. Cover didn't work. Dispersion didn't work. The shells found the optimal height automatically and converted kinetic energy into shrapnel with mechanical efficiency. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German soldiers who survived proximity-fused artillery strikes described the experience as psychologically devastating. Artillery had always been the war's most feared killer. Statistics from both world wars showed artillery causing more casualties than small arms, tanks, or aircraft combined. But conventional artillery gave defenders options: dig deeper, find better cover, move after hearing the whistle of incoming shells. Proximity fuses eliminated those options. The shells detonated whether you were in a trench or behind a log pile or in a shell crater. The fragments came from above, penetrating cover that had protected soldiers from horizontal fire. And the consistency meant every shell achieved maximum effect. No duds buried in the mud, no rounds detonating too high or too low, just mathematically predictable casualty production. German frontline reports described situations where soldiers refused to leave bunkers during American artillery attacks, a breakdown in discipline that approached mutiny. The prospect of facing proximity-fused fire terrified troops who had previously endured conventional bombardment with reasonable survival chances. German commanders noted the change in their tactical assessments. American artillery effectiveness had approximately doubled from some new capability they didn't understand. The shells were arriving at correct height without the usual bracketing fire that preceded well-aimed conventional attacks. And the lethality forced changes in German defensive doctrine that rippled through operational planning. German technical intelligence eventually determined they were facing some form of automatic altitude-sensing fuse. Captured unexploded shells from multiple artillery strikes provided examples for examination. German scientists and engineers carefully disassembled the fuses, photographing components, measuring dimensions, analyzing circuit designs. They found miniature vacuum tubes manufactured to tolerances that exceeded anything in German production. They found battery designs they'd never seen. They found radio circuits of remarkable sophistication packed into impossibly small volumes. The analysis confirmed what they already believed. Such devices could not possibly survive artillery launch forces. Therefore, these elaborate miniature radio sets must serve some other purpose. This conclusion, born from German engineers' own assessment of technical impossibility, meant they failed to recognize the actual mechanism by which the fuses functioned. Some German analysts proposed the Americans had developed extremely sophisticated mechanical time fuses that used the radio components for electromagnetic interference or electronic countermeasures. Others suggested the devices might be experimental guidance systems for a new type of directed artillery round. But the simple explanation that Americans had solved the engineering problems German researchers deemed insurmountable never gained traction. The Germans had convinced themselves proximity fuses were impossible, so when faced with working proximity fuses, they constructed elaborate, alternative explanations rather than accepting that American engineering had achieved what German engineering could not. American forces, meanwhile, prepared for potential German countermeasures despite the enemy's failure to understand the technology. Winfield Salisbury, one of the proximity fuses developers, had anticipated the possibility that German forces might develop electronic jamming once they recognized the fuses used radio frequencies. He designed a simple jamming countermeasure that could be carried aboard bombers. 200 jammers were rapidly manufactured and deployed to American bomber squadrons in England, but the jammers were never needed. German engineers remained convinced that proximity fuses were impossible, so they never attempted to jam a technology they believed didn't exist. The Battle of the Bulge became the proving ground for proximity-fused artillery in European ground combat. Between December 19, 1944, and the end of January 1945, American forces fired approximately 200,000 shells equipped with VT fuses. The impact on German offensive capabilities was measurable in casualty statistics and territorial outcomes. German advances that might have succeeded under conventional artillery fire stalled under proximity-fused bombardment. German forces that had felt relatively safe from timed fire due to poor weather conditions, preventing aerial observation, suddenly found themselves exposed to artillery that didn't require visual correction. The shells knew when to explode regardless of visibility, weather, or observer availability. General Patton wrote to the War Department describing the new shells as devastating and crediting them with requiring a complete revision of land warfare tactics. The letter captured military leadership's recognition that proximity fuses represented more than incremental improvement. They constituted a fundamental change in artillery's role and effectiveness. Wars throughout history had been won by forces that achieved tactical superiority through technological innovation. Proximity fuses gave American artillery that edge. And German forces, fighting desperately to hold defensive positions as Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine, bore the consequences of facing an innovation they couldn't counter or understand. By March of 1945, the strategic situation in Europe had shifted decisively in favor of Allied forces. The Battle of the Bulge had expended Germany's last significant operational reserves. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. German industry struggled under sustained strategic bombing, and German ground forces faced artillery that killed with mechanical precision they couldn't defend against. From December 1944 through March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire also accounted for more than 1,000 German aircraft destroyed. The fuses performed their dual role, killing from the air and killing from above, transforming both naval anti-aircraft defense and ground artillery into unprecedented weapons of mathematical lethality. The Pacific Theater told a similar story with different tactical implications. Japanese kamikaze attacks, which began in organized form during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, represented Japan's response to unsustainable aircraft and pilot losses. Conventional attacks against American carrier task forces had become nearly impossible due to superior American fighter defenses and radar-directed combat air patrol. Kamikaze tactics accepted pilot death as operational requirement, transforming aircraft into guided missiles that pursued targets until impact or destruction. The tactic exploited a vulnerability in conventional anti-aircraft defenses. Time-fused shells required prediction of target position seconds in advance, but kamikaze pilots flew erratically, changed altitude and course frequently, and accepted any approach angle that allowed them to reach their targets. Proximity fuses neutralized much of kamikaze tactical advantage. The shells didn't need to predict future target position. They simply needed to pass near the target, which their radio circuits detected automatically. A kamikaze pilot's evasive maneuvering, designed to defeat time-fused predictive fire, became irrelevant against fuses that adapted to target behavior in microseconds. Combat statistics from the carrier task forces demonstrated the effectiveness difference. During 1944, naval anti-aircraft guns fired 32,826 rounds of proximity-fused ammunition, destroying aircraft at an average rate of 421 rounds per kill. The rate had increased from 1943's 155 rounds per kill because American doctrine emphasized opening fire at extreme range, but the effectiveness still exceeded conventional ammunition by substantial margins. The final months of the Pacific War, from April through August of 1945 during the Okinawa campaign, provided the most comprehensive combat test of proximity fuse capabilities. The Battle of Okinawa saw the most intense kamikaze operations of the war. Japan committed over 1,500 aircraft to suicide attacks against American naval forces supporting the invasion. The concentrated attacks should have inflicted catastrophic casualties on the fleet. Instead, proximity fuses allowed American anti-aircraft defenses to create kill zones around high-value targets that few kamikaze aircraft penetrated successfully. The destroyer USS Hadley faced 156 attacking aircraft during a single 90-minute engagement on May 11, 1945. The ship's 5-inch guns, firing proximity-fused ammunition, destroyed 12 aircraft before the Hadley sustained damage, forcing her withdrawal. Her sister ship USS Evans destroyed 23 attackers before retiring. The after-action reports credited VT-fused ammunition as indispensable to survival. Without proximity fuses, standard tactical assessment suggested both destroyers would have been sunk with massive crew casualties. Instead, they survived despite overwhelming numerical odds, testament to technological superiority, translating into tactical outcomes. Statistical analysis showed proximity fuses increased anti-aircraft effectiveness against kamikaze attacks by factors ranging from 3 to 1 to 7 to 1, depending on engagement circumstances. Night interceptions, traditionally almost impossible with conventional fuses, achieved 370% better results with proximity fuses that didn't require visual tracking. The technology allowed American ships to defend against threats that would have been catastrophic using World War I-era artillery doctrine. The fuses didn't just improve existing capabilities. They enabled entirely new tactical approaches to fleet defense. But effectiveness came at a cost beyond the financial investment of over $1 billion 1940s dollars. Reliability remained imperfect despite extensive quality control. Estimates suggested that between 30 and 50% of proximity fuses failed to function as designed. Some didn't arm properly after firing. Some detonated prematurely. Some failed to detect targets at correct ranges. Some simply malfunctioned due to component failure under artillery stresses. A 50% failure rate sounds catastrophic until compared to alternative technologies. Mechanical time fuses, which had been refined over decades of development, achieved 90 to 95% reliability. But a proximity fuse that worked 50% of the time still delivered 3 to 7 times the effectiveness of conventional fuses that worked 95% of the time. Lethality favored unreliable but innovative technology over reliable but outdated technology, and the American industrial capacity to produce millions of fuses meant that reliability issues could be addressed through sheer volume. If half the fuses failed, build twice as many fuses. The approach worked because American manufacturing capability exceeded that of any other combatant nation. Germany couldn't have matched American proximity fuse production even if German engineers had successfully developed the technology, because German industry lacked the production capacity to manufacture millions of precision electronic devices while simultaneously producing tanks, aircraft, submarines, and conventional ammunition. By August of 1945, when Japan surrendered following atomic bomb strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American forces had produced and deployed over 22 million proximity fuses. The scale represented one of the war's remarkable industrial achievements. Each fuse contained approximately 100 to 30 separate components manufactured to tolerances that pushed existing production capabilities. The supply chain involved over 110 factories operated by 87 different firms. The coordination required to maintain quality control across that distributed manufacturing network while simultaneously ramping production to meet combat demand demonstrated organizational sophistication that matched the fuse's technical sophistication. Post-war assessments attempted to quantify proximity fuses' contribution to Allied victory. Admiral Lewis Strauss described the fuse as one of the most original and effective military developments of World War II. Admiral Arleigh Burke credited proximity fuses with allowing carrier task forces to operate despite Japanese air attacks that should have inflicted prohibitive casualties. General Dwight Eisenhower stated that if Germany had perfected proximity fuses 6 months earlier, Allied invasion of Europe would have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. The counterfactual speculation acknowledged that the technology's value wasn't limited to offensive applications. Defensive use of proximity fuses by German anti-aircraft artillery could have devastated Allied strategic bombing campaigns, but Germany never achieved that capability. German proximity fuse research remained fragmented across competing programs that pursued over 30 different technical approaches without coordination or prioritization. German military leadership never implemented the focused industrial program that characterized American fuse development. And by the time German engineers recognized Americans had succeeded, where German theory said success was impossible, Germany lacked the industrial capacity and material resources to respond effectively. The technical innovation that made proximity fuses possible depended on manufacturing capabilities that existed primarily in the United States. Miniaturized vacuum tubes required precision glass working and metal fabrication. Radio circuits demanded components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Battery designs needed chemical engineering expertise and quality control. The complete fuse demanded assembly procedures that maintained reliability despite incorporating dozens of potential failure points. Only American industry possessed the combination of technical knowledge, manufacturing precision, quality control systems, and production scale to translate laboratory prototypes into millions of deployable weapons. Japan developed a working proximity fuse late in the war, but never achieved mass production. Japanese industry, devastated by American strategic bombing and maritime blockade, lacked the capacity to manufacture complex electronic devices in militarily significant quantities. Japanese engineers successfully solved the technical problems. They understood the principles, replicated the designs, and built functional prototypes, but they couldn't bridge the gap between prototype and deployment. The same industrial weakness that limited Japanese production of aircraft, tanks, and ships also prevented Japanese proximity fuse production from affecting the war's outcome. British forces used American-supplied proximity fuses throughout the war's final years. British anti-aircraft defences employed VT-fused ammunition against German Von flying bombs with devastating effectiveness. The proportion of V1s destroyed by coastal anti-aircraft batteries increased from 17% to 74% after proximity fuses entered service, reaching 82% during peak performance days. When Germany adjusted Von flight profiles to fly at lower altitudes around 1,200 feet, making interception more difficult, American engineers rapidly modified fuse designs to maintain effectiveness. The modified fuses were manufactured at Crosley facilities and transported to Antwerp via special Lancaster bomber flights authorized by Winston Churchill, demonstrating the weapon's strategic importance. The Von defensive campaign saved London from sustained terror bombing that could have affected British industrial production and civilian morale during the war's final year. Churchill credited proximity fuses with protecting British cities and supporting the Allied advance across Europe. The weapon that began as a solution to naval anti-aircraft problems had evolved into a multi-role technology that influenced air defense, ground artillery, and strategic bombing operations. American bomber forces used proximity-fused bombs against Japanese anti-aircraft positions during the war's final months. 24 liberators attacking targets in northern Italy in April of 1945 dropped VT-fused bombs on German anti-aircraft emplacements, immediately silencing defensive fire and allowing follow-on bomber formations to attack unmolested. Similar tactics in July 1945 carrier raids against Japanese naval bases saw approximately one-third of bombs carrying proximity fuses that effectively suppressed anti-aircraft defenses ahead of main strike. Packages. The fuses demonstrated versatility that extended beyond their original anti-aircraft artillery application into offensive bombing operations. The technology's post-war legacy shaped Cold War weapons development and modern military doctrine. Proximity fuses became standard equipment for anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells, and aerial bombs. The principles developed during World War II influenced surface-to-air missile designs, air-to-air missiles, and smart munitions that dominated late 20th century warfare. The Phoenix AIM-54 missile, standard surface-to-air missiles, and Patriot systems all incorporated proximity fuse concepts refined from World War II research. The fundamental innovation weapons that sensed their proximity to targets and detonated automatically at optimal range remained central to precision weapons development for decades. But the immediate post-war period saw proximity fuses disappear from public awareness almost as completely as they'd been hidden during wartime. The Manhattan Project received extensive media coverage after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Radar development became widely known as a crucial Allied advantage. Proximity fuses remained classified, their role in Allied victory obscured by security restrictions that persisted into the Cold War. The workers who assembled millions of fuses in American factories, many of them women who'd entered industrial work during wartime mobilization, often didn't know what they'd been building. Security compartmentalization meant assembly line workers manufactured components without understanding the complete weapon system. Mary Conley worked at the former Ipswich Mills in Massachusetts, one of over 100 factories involved in proximity fuse production. She transported engineering plans between facilities under armed guard, carrying designs for components whose purpose remained classified. Victoria Skibbis, Helen Thurber, Phyllis Hills, and thousands of others assembled miniature components to precise specifications, without knowing those components would save thousands of Allied lives. The secrecy that protected the technology during the war also obscured these workers' contributions to Allied victory. The financial cost of $1 billion 1940s dollars, equivalent to approximately $15 billion today, represented enormous investment in a single weapon system. But the return on that investment, measured in casualties prevented and tactical advantages gained, justified the expenditure. Admiral Lewis Strauss's assessment that proximity fuses must be listed among the very small group of developments upon which victory very largely depended captured the military establishment's recognition of the technology's decisive importance. Not because proximity fuses alone won the war, but because they provided margins of superiority that accumulated across thousands of combat engagements into decisive strategic outcomes. Lieutenant Red Cochrane, whose gun crew aboard USS Helena achieved the first combat kill with proximity-fused ammunition, survived the war and returned to civilian life. USS Helena herself was sunk by Japanese torpedoes during the Battle of Kula Gulf in July of 1943, 6 months after her proximity-fuse success off Guadalcanal. The cruiser's loss demonstrated that technological superiority didn't guarantee survival in naval combat. But the innovation her gun crews first deployed in combat continued influencing warfare long after the ship's destruction. Dr. Merle Tuve and the Section T scientists who developed the proximity fuse received limited public recognition despite their contribution to Allied victory. Tuve returned to civilian research after the war, continuing his physics career at the Carnegie Institution. James Van Allen, who helped develop the rugged miniature vacuum tubes essential to fuse function, later became famous for discovering the Van Allen radiation belts during early space exploration. The proximity fuse represented an intermediate achievement in careers that spanned fundamental scientific research and applied engineering. The workers at Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, McQuay Norris, and Sylvania, who manufactured millions of fuses, returned to peacetime production. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for proximity fuse production influenced post-war electronics industries. Miniaturization expertise that created thumbnail-sized vacuum tubes capable of withstanding 20,000 times gravity informed later developments in electronics, computing, and communications. The industrial knowledge generated by proximity fuse production didn't disappear when the war ended. It transformed into civilian applications that shaped the post-war technological landscape. General George Patton's assessment that proximity fuses required revision of land warfare tactics proved prophetic. Modern artillery doctrine assumes precision-guided munitions and smart fuses as standard capabilities. The concept that artillery shells should know when to explode rather than relying on preset timing became fundamental to contemporary military thinking. The innovation that seemed impossible to German engineers in 1944 became routine in militaries worldwide by the 21st century. The technical challenges that consumed 3% of American physicists during World War II were solved permanently. Their solutions incorporated into weapons systems that descended directly from the Mark 32 fuse that Lieutenant Cochrane's gun crew fired off Guadalcanal. The irony runs deeper than German engineers failing to recognize captured proximity fuses' function. Both German and Japanese technical intelligence possessed sophisticated understanding of physics, electronics, and military engineering. German scientists had pioneered much of 20th century physics. Japanese engineers had designed some of the war's most advanced aircraft and naval vessels. But neither nation achieved proximity fuse deployment because the innovation required more than scientific knowledge. It demanded industrial capacity, organizational coordination, quality control systems, and manufacturing precision that existed primarily in the United States. American industrial supremacy, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic military narratives, provided the foundation that transformed scientific innovation into deployed weapons. The proximity fuse succeeded not just because American scientists solved the technical problems, but because American factories could manufacture millions of devices to specifications that maintained functionality despite inevitable production variations. The supply chain coordination that delivered components from over 100 factories to assembly plants that produced 70,000 fuses daily represented organizational achievement as impressive as the technical innovation itself. The shells that violated German engineers' assumptions about technical possibility were crude by later standards. The vacuum tubes that seemed impossibly miniaturized in 1942 were obsolete within decades, replaced by transistors and then integrated circuits. The radio circuits that required cutting-edge engineering became elementary examples in post-war electronics textbooks. But in their historical context, proximity fuses represented the bleeding edge of possible achievement, pushing manufacturing and design capabilities to limits that redefined those limits. The story that began with Lieutenant Cochrane's gun crew firing 3 shells at retreating Japanese bombers concluded with over 22 million fuses deployed worldwide, transforming both anti-aircraft defense and ground artillery into weapons of unprecedented lethality. The innovation that British scientists declared impossible for artillery applications became standard American equipment. The technology that German engineers failed to recognize even after examining captured examples helped determine the war's outcome. And the manufacturing achievement that produced millions of precision electronic devices under wartime conditions demonstrated American industrial capacity that no enemy nation could match. Modern military historians debate which innovations most influenced World War II's outcome. Strategic bombing, radar, cryptography, atomic weapons, industrial production, and tactical doctrine all receive attention. Proximity fuses rarely achieve equivalent recognition despite their measurable impact on combat effectiveness, perhaps because the technology worked invisibly, inside shells that looked identical to conventional ammunition, perhaps because the secrecy that protected the innovation during the war continued obscuring it afterward, or perhaps because the story lacks the dramatic immediacy of bomber formations, tank battles, or amphibious invasions. But for the sailors aboard ships that survived kamikaze attacks due to proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, for the soldiers who advanced under artillery protection that killed enemy forces with unprecedented efficiency, for the civilians in London whose city remained functional despite Vosne bombardment, the proximity fuse's importance needed no dramatic narrative. It was measured in survival, in mission success, in casualties prevented. The technology didn't end the war or guarantee victory, but it provided margins of tactical superiority that accumulated into strategic advantage, and those margins often meant the difference between success and failure, survival and death, victory and defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.